A man who understood himself too well. There are criminals who act without understanding, and then there are those who understand everything and still move forward. Edmund Kemper was not confused about who he was. He did not hide behind chaos. He did not pretend ignorance. He did not need to construct a false identity to justify his actions. He knew, and that is what makes him different. Because most people rely on a simple belief to stay human, that awareness creates restraint, that if you understand your darkness, you can control it. Edmund Kemper is the collapse of that belief. This is not a story about violence. This is a study of a mind that saw itself clearly and chose not to stop. Childhood, where control first took shape. Edmund Kemper did not grow up in mystery. His environment was not subtle, it was not hidden. It was loud in its structure, but quiet in its damage. His mother did not need to hurt him physically to shape him. She used something more precise: control, humiliation, and repetition. From an early age, Edmund was not treated as a child. He was treated as a problem, a presence to be contained, a personality to be corrected. She did not see potential in him. She saw danger, and when a child is repeatedly told that he is dangerous before he understands what that even means, something irreversible begins. Not anger, not rebellion, but alignment. Edmund did not reject the label. He absorbed it. He grew up physically large, taller, and stronger than most children his age. And this only reinforced the narrative. His size made people uncomfortable. His mother used that discomfort as evidence. You see, you are different. You are not like other boys. This is how identity forms under pressure, not from inside but from reflection. A child becomes what he is consistently told he is, and Edmund was told he was wrong, not occasionally, constantly. At night, his mother made him sleep in the basement, not because there was no space, but because she did not want him near her. Think about what that teaches a developing mind. You are not welcome, you are not safe to be around, you belong somewhere else. Isolation, when introduced early enough, does not feel like punishment, it feels like truth. Edmund did not learn connection, he learned distance, he learned observation, he learned to sit with his thoughts long before he had the emotional tools to understand them. And when thoughts grow without guidance, they do not become clearer, they become louder. His imagination did not develop in a balanced way, it developed in isolation, detached from correction, detached from empathy, detached from consequence. He began to construct scenarios in his mind, not out of cruelty but out of curiosity. Curiosity about control, about power, about what it means to be the one who decides. And this is where people misunderstand early psychology. It is not the presence of dark thoughts that defines someone. It is whether those thoughts are interrupted, redirected, challenged. Edmund had none of that. His mother did not guide him, she labeled him. And labeling is easier than understanding. But it is also far more dangerous, because when a child is given an identity without explanation, he will spend the rest of his life trying to live up to it. Edmund did not grow up asking, "Who am I?" He grew up asking, "If I am already seen as this, then what is the point of resisting it?" And that question does not create violence, it creates permission. Adolescence, when identity stops resisting. Adolescence is where most people begin to separate from their childhood. They question, they resist, they redefine who they are. Edmund Kemper did not. He did something far more dangerous. He accepted. By the time he entered his teenage years, the structure of his identity was already in place, not because he understood himself, but because he had stopped trying to argue with the version of himself that had been handed to him. His mother had spent years defining him as something abnormal, something threatening, something wrong. And eventually, the mind does what it always does under repetition. It adapts. Edmund began to see himself not as misunderstood, but as fundamentally different. Not broken, not lost, but separate. This separation is important, because once a person no longer feels connected to others, empathy does not disappear suddenly, it fades. Quietly, gradually, almost logically. He did not wake up one day and decide to stop caring. He simply stopped seeing others as part of the same system. They were no longer like him. They were something else, something external, something he observed rather than related to. At school, he did not fit in, not just socially, but psychologically. Other teenagers were chaotic, emotional, reactive. They were driven by impulse, insecurity, attraction, fear. Edmund watched them, not with jealousy, but with distance. He noticed how easily they were influenced, how quickly they shifted their opinions, how desperately they sought approval. And instead of wanting to be part of that, he began to feel something else. A quiet internal conclusion. They don't understand themselves. And when you believe others don't understand themselves, it becomes easier to believe you understand them better than they do. This is where control begins to feel justified, not as domination, but as clarity. Edmund was not impulsive, he was reflective. He thought about his thoughts, he analyzed his reactions. He tried to understand the mechanics of his own mind, but there was a problem. Self-awareness without guidance does not create balance, it creates distortion. Because when you analyze yourself in isolation, you are both the observer and the subject. There is no correction, no contradiction, no external truth. Edmund's thoughts became self-reinforcing. If he felt anger, he justified it. If he felt distance, he rationalized it. If he felt different, he concluded it was because he was. This is how identity solidifies without reality. Around this time, his relationship with his mother did not improve. It intensified. She did not soften. She did not adjust. She continued to speak to him as if he was already what she feared he might become. And something subtle began to shift inside him. Not hatred, not yet, but clarity. He began to understand that in her eyes, he was not a son. He was a prediction. And if someone treats you as a prediction long enough, you begin to ask a dangerous question. What if they're right? This is the moment where resistance fades. Edmund stopped trying to prove her wrong. He stopped trying to become something else. He stopped trying to belong. And when you stop trying to belong, you start trying to define your own system. His thoughts became more structured, more organized, more deliberate. He began to think less about why do I feel this way, and more about what does this mean about who I am. That shift matters, because it moves a person from emotion into identity, and once something becomes identity, it is no longer questioned, it is expressed. Edmund was not spiraling, he was stabilizing, but he was stabilizing in the wrong direction. He became calm, quiet, controlled. Not because he found peace, but because he removed conflict. He no longer argued with himself, he no longer resisted his thoughts, he no longer tried to align with others. He accepted the distance, he accepted the difference. He accepted the idea that he was not part of the same emotional structure as everyone else. And in that acceptance, something disappeared. Not morality, not yet, but friction. The internal resistance that stops a thought from becoming action. Most people live with constant friction. They think things they never act on. They feel impulses they suppress. They imagine possibilities they reject. Edmund began to lose that friction, not completely, but enough to start wondering what would happen if thought did not have to remain thought. And once that question becomes real, it does not go away. It sits, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when curiosity becomes permission. Edmund Kemper did not become who he was in a moment of rage. He became who he was the moment he stopped resisting himself. And from that point forward, everything that followed was not a loss of control. It was a continuation of the first break, when thought becomes action. There is a moment in every dangerous mind where thought stops being theoretical. It does not feel dramatic. It does not arrive with warning. It feels inevitable. For Edmund Kemper, that moment was not an explosion. It was a transition. By the time he reached this point, he had already done the most important thing psychologically. He had removed resistance. He was no longer asking himself if something was wrong. He was asking something else entirely. If this is who I am, what happens when I stop holding it back? This is not curiosity in the normal sense. This is permission forming inside logic. When most people imagine the first break, they imagine loss of control. But in Kemper's case, it was the opposite. It was control becoming complete. His thoughts had been rehearsed, analyzed, revisited. Not emotionally, but structurally. He understood his impulses. He understood when they appeared. He understood what triggered them. And because he understood them, he no longer feared them. Fear creates distance. Understanding removes it. This is the danger of self-awareness without morality. It does not stop behavior, it refines it. When Kemper crossed that line for the first time, there was no internal collapse, no shock, no immediate regret. What followed was something far more unsettling. Recognition. Not recognition of the act, recognition of alignment. His actions matched his internal identity. And for the first time, there was no contradiction. This is what people misunderstand. They expect a person to feel horror at themselves, to recoil, to panic. Kemper did not. He observed. He analyzed what he had done the same way he had analyzed his thoughts for years. What did this mean? What did this confirm? What changed? And the answer in his mind was simple. Nothing had changed. This was not transformation. This was confirmation. And confirmation is powerful, because once a person believes their actions reflect their true nature, they stop questioning the direction. They begin refining it. Kemper did not see himself as out of control. He saw himself as accurate. Accurate to what he had always been. Accurate to what had always been building. This is where his internal logic becomes dangerous. He did not justify what he did by saying it was right. He justified it by saying it was consistent, and consistency feels like truth. From that point forward, his thinking changed in a subtle but critical way. He no longer asked, "Should I do this?" He asked, "How do I do this without interruption?" That shift removes morality from the equation entirely. It becomes about execution, not ethics. Kemper's mind did not become chaotic. It became organized. He began to understand patterns more clearly, not just in himself, but in others. He saw how people moved through the world, how predictable they were, how unaware they were of their surroundings, and instead of seeing that as innocence, he saw it as opportunity. This is where empathy fully dissolves, not through hatred, but through reclassification. Other people were no longer equals, they were variables. Variables can be studied, controlled, used, and when you reduce people to variables, you remove the emotional weight of interacting with them. Kemper did not feel the need to rush. He was patient. Because he did not feel urgency, he felt inevitability, and inevitability does not panic, it waits. After each action, his internal process remained the same. Review, adjust, understand. Not to feel, not to process guilt, but to improve clarity. This is what separates Kemper from many others. He was not lost inside his behavior. He was present, fully aware, fully conscious, fully capable of explaining what he was doing and why. And yet, none of that awareness translated into restraint. Because awareness alone is not a boundary, it is just information. And information without values becomes a tool. Kemper used his understanding of himself to remove uncertainty, and once uncertainty disappears, so does hesitation. This is how escalation begins, not through loss of control, but through increased efficiency. What once felt significant begins to feel familiar. What once required thought begins to feel automatic. And when something becomes automatic, it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like continuation. Kemper did not see himself as changing. He saw himself as becoming clearer, clearer about who he was, clearer about how he functioned, clearer about what mattered to him. And what mattered was not connection, not empathy, not consequence. It was control aligned with identity. That alignment is the point of no return. Because once a person believes their actions are simply an expression of their true self, there is nothing left to resist. Escalation when control becomes a prison. Control, when it first appears, feels like freedom. It removes confusion, it removes hesitation, it creates clarity where there was once noise. For Edmund Kemper, control was not a tool, it was identity. By this point, he understood himself better than most people ever do. He knew what triggered his thoughts. He knew how his mind moved. He knew how to act without being detected. And that level of awareness creates a dangerous illusion, the illusion that nothing can surprise you. But there is a flaw in that belief. You can understand your behavior and still not understand its direction. Kemper believed he was in control because he was aware, but awareness does not stop momentum. It only describes it. And his momentum was increasing, not dramatically, not chaotically, but steadily. Each action reinforced the same internal conclusion: I know what I am doing. And that belief is more dangerous than ignorance, because ignorance leaves room for doubt, but certainty eliminates it. Kemper did not question himself anymore. He observed himself. And observation is passive. It watches, it records, it does not intervene. This is where control begins to shift. What once felt like mastery starts to become routine. Routine removes meaning. And when meaning disappears, the mind looks for something stronger, not out of desire, but out of necessity. This is escalation, not driven by emotion, driven by diminishing effect. What once created clarity now feels insufficient, and instead of stepping back, the mind pushes forward. Kemper did not experience escalation as a loss of control. He experienced it as adjustment, a refinement of process. But inside that refinement, something began to change, not externally, not visibly, internally. For the first time, there were moments of brief, controlled, almost silent, where the structure did not feel complete, not guilt, not regret, something else, a gap, a small break in the alignment he had built, and because Kemper was self-aware, he noticed it. He noticed that even as he maintained control, the sense of clarity was no longer absolute. There were fragments of something he could not fully define, not emotion, not conscience, but inconsistency. And inconsistency is dangerous to a mind built on control. Because control depends on predictability. If something inside you becomes unpredictable, control becomes fragile. Kemper tried to analyze it. That was his instinct. To observe, to understand, to reduce complexity into structure. But this was different. Because the thing he was trying to understand was not behavior, it was absence of meaning. He had built a system where everything made sense, where every action aligned with identity, where nothing contradicted itself. And now, for the first time, that system was no longer complete. This is where the mind faces a critical choice: to stop or to go deeper. Stopping would require questioning everything, questioning identity, questioning logic, questioning the entire structure he had built. Kemper did not do that. He chose the other direction. He went deeper. Because going deeper preserves identity. It allows the mind to say, this still works, I just haven't gone far enough. This is how escalation becomes a trap, not because it spirals out of control, but because it feels like the only path forward. Kemper was not chasing excitement. He was chasing completion, a state where everything aligned again, where there were no gaps, no inconsistencies, no internal noise. But that state no longer existed, because once a system breaks, it cannot return to its original form, and this is the moment where control stops being power and becomes a prison. Kemper was still calm, still aware, still precise. But underneath that precision, there was something new, not chaos, pressure, a slow building pressure created by a system that no longer fully worked, and because he could not step outside of himself, he could not release it. He could only continue. This is where the final stage begins, not collapse, but inevitability. Confession, when control finally stops. There is a moment people expect in stories like this, a breaking point, a collapse, a loss of control so complete that everything unravels. Edmund Kemper did not unravel, he stopped. And that difference matters. Because stopping is not the same as losing control. Stopping is a decision. By the time Kemper turned himself in, he was not confused. He was not overwhelmed. He was not searching for escape. He was finished. Not finished in the sense of regret. Not finished in the sense of understanding what he had done. Finished in the sense that the system he had built no longer functioned. Control had carried him for years. It had organized his thoughts, aligned his actions, removed hesitation. But now it no longer led anywhere. This is something people rarely consider. A person can reach the end of a path without ever questioning whether the path was wrong. Kemper did not arrive at confession through guilt. He arrived through completion. There was nothing left to refine, nothing left to adjust, nothing left to understand, and when a system no longer evolves, it becomes useless. For someone like Kemper, uselessness is intolerable. He did not need to run, he did not need to hide, because there was no longer anything to protect. This is why his confession feels so different. It was not emotional, it was not chaotic, it was not desperate. It was structured, clear, deliberate. He explained himself the same way he had always thought about himself, with distance, with logic, with awareness. And this is what unsettles people the most. He understood what he had done. He understood how he had become what he was. He understood the patterns, the triggers, the progression, and yet none of that understanding had ever stopped him. Because understanding is not the same as restraint, and this is the core of his psychology. Most people believe that awareness creates boundaries, that if you can see your own darkness clearly enough, you will step away from it. Kemper proves the opposite. You can see everything and still continue. You can know exactly who you are and never try to change it. At the end, there was no transformation, no redemption, no sudden emergence of empathy. What remained was the same mind that had always been there. Calm, aware, detached. The only difference was context. No more movement, no more process, no more continuation, just stillness. And in that stillness, there was nothing new to discover, no hidden layer, no deeper truth. Because Kemper had already explored everything within himself, he had reached the limit of his own system, and beyond that limit, there was nothing. Not meaning, not purpose, just emptiness. That is the final reality, not chaos, not evil as something dramatic, but a mind that replaced connection with control and found nothing waiting for it at the end. What this really means: Edmund Kemper is not disturbing because he was unaware. He is disturbing because he was not. He understood himself. He understood his actions. He understood the path he was on. And he walked it anyway. This is not a story about losing control. It is a story about what happens when control becomes the only thing that matters. Because control can organize a life. It can shape behavior. It can create the illusion of clarity, but it cannot replace meaning. And when a person builds their entire identity on control, they eventually reach a point where nothing is left to control. That is where the story ends, not in noise, not in chaos, but in silence. If this made you think, leave a like, subscribe, and stay with the series. We're just getting started.